When you hear Claymore, what comes to your mind? Not the type of explosive. We're talking sword here. This is probably what a lot of you have in mind. But unfortunately, that's not a Claymore. Alright, so what is up with that? There is some confusion. Claymore comes from the word clay of more, which is not dwarven slang for your mother is a clam, although it might as well be, but it's Scottish Gaelic. And the word is often attributed to a two-handed sword. However, in Gaelic, that would be a clay of dalive. That refers to a two-handed sword. In fact, literally two-handed sword. Just like a lot of other people, the German word Zweihander means two-handed sword, literally two-hander, or the Italian word spada a due mani. They were pretty pragmatic back in the day. It's just, this sword is used with two hands. It's a two-handed sword. What, you need any other terms for it? That's what it is. The most iconic form of the sword is this, with the angular quillons with quatrefoil tips and the tongs extending from the quillon block up the blade. That's what everybody thinks of. And speaking of iconic, the sword of William Wallace is not like that at all. It's often shown that way. But William Wallace's sword was actually taken after his execution in 1305, and it had the blade repaired twice, and the hilt was replaced several times. The current hilt is a copy of the first replacement hilt that was put on it in 1505. So it's a little complicated, just like the terminology. Museums still often refer to Scottish two-handed swords as claymores, even though it's technically not the right term. But at this point, it's just a solidly entrenched misnomer. Most people think of that. Here's a classic example that you can see displayed at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. This one is from the early 16th century. And currently, the Canadian War Museum is running the Highland Warrior exhibition. It goes from June 7th, 2019 to January 12th, 2020. It covers a number of themes, from the Clan to the Jacobite rebellions to Highland regiments in modern warfare to the role of Highland traditions in the Canadian military. Many Scottish immigrants grew successful in Canada, and after the Canadian Confederation of 1867, it became popular to join Highland or Scottish militia units. You may have seen my videos of the HEMA tournament at the Highland Games here in Victoria on Vancouver Island, where I learned of the hidden horrors of prolonged bagpipe exposure. Don't get me wrong, bagpipes are cool and I've always liked the tunes, but after 8 hours of almost non-stop bagpipes in the background, that messed with my brain in ways I did not anticipate. Anyway, what's really awesome is that the Canadian War Museum is sponsoring me, and I will be taking a trip there in late September. That's going to be really exciting, and of course, you'll get to see videos of that. There will be a closer look at original Scottish swords. We'll also be looking at other interesting stuff like dirks, pistols, outfits. Oh, by the way, kilts are not actually medieval. They didn't appear before the 17th century. Sorry. And one more cool thing, there will be a giveaway of 4 family admissions to the Canadian War Museum. More about that at the end of the video, so stick around. Don't you dare go anywhere else. Anyway, so back to the Scottish two-handed sword. The strangest example is this sword here at the National Museum of Scotland. It has 4 quillons. It's one of the weirdest things I've seen in terms of historical weapons. 4 quillons, a handle made of a narwhal tusk. Now, according to the curator at the museum there, the tang was broken and the organic handle simply deformed over time. So it was originally straight. But either way, this is pretty odd. There are other types as well, less well known, like shell guard two-handed swords. They have a clamshell guard for hand protection and typically upswept curved quillons. Then there's also lowland swords. These are much larger, so these are really comparable to the German two-handed sword. You might have seen my test and review of Hanwei's reproduction. Those things are gigantic. It's ridiculous in a good way. So on to the Claymore. So the Claymore. This literally means great sword. Now that's even more confusing because greatsword is also a term used for two-handed swords, but it just means greatsword as in large sword, as in compared to smaller swords. We'll get back to that in a moment. So this is a single-handed sword with a basket hilt, also called a basket-hilt backsword in case of a single-edged blade, or a basket-hilt broadsword where it has a double-edged blade. Now, broad simply is relative to the rapier, a type of sword that the Englishman George Silver was not particularly fond of, to say the least. The way he talks about the rapier in his manuscript approaches almost what I would like to call nerd rage. It's kind of entertaining. Anyway, so the word first appears in a written record in 1643 Scotland, where it's mentioned as part of standard equipment of levy troops. So Scots themselves called the sword a claymore at the time it was used. So if nothing else, then that settles the uncertainty. This is a claymore. There you go. So essentially it replaced the two-handed sword, at least in Scotland. English basket-hilt swords coexisted for a longer time, and of course there were also German basket-hilt backswords from the 16th century, for example. In the 17th century, armor had largely fallen out of favor in most places, with some exceptions, and gauntlets were not usually used anymore. So integrated hand protection was developed for swords. According to John Wallace in his 1970 book, Scottish Swords and Dirks, the Scottish basket hilt was apparently referred to as Highland hilt. So it was seen as distinctly Scottish, even though the English also had basket hilt swords, as mentioned, and they actually started using them earlier. Here's an English basket hilt sword from the early 17th century at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It may look similar to a Venetian schiavona, which is actually of Slavic origin, but apparently they are not directly related. And in a painting by Michael Wright from 1660 to 70, you can see what's considered the likely first depiction of a Scottish basket hilt. This is what's called a ribbon hilt, referring to the ribbons of steel welded together to form a handguard. And Claude Blair in 1981 compared the hilt to a scooped-out melon, apparently. Sounds a little odd, but yeah, I guess the guard is kind of shaped like a melon that has been cut open and scooped out to make space for the hand. The grips are often made of shark skin-covered wood with a brass or silver wire wrap. Sometimes it's just wood or deer horn wrapped with wire directly. Here's a basket-hilted backsword from the Canadian War Museum from the mid-18th century. So you can actually see the shark skin wrap there in the close-up. In the mid-17th century, liners were added to the inside of the basket made of deerskin or buff leather, which is soft but strong bull or elk hide. And then in the 18th and 19th centuries, the liner was made of red cloth or velvet and covered the entire interior of the basket. In the 18th century, the small sword became popular in England, which is this sort of dainty-looking thrusting sword. The Scots at the same time stuck to their broadsword and backsword, which at that point were exclusively Scottish. So there you can really see, broadsword compared to something like a rapier, let alone a small sword. Looks pretty large, or even great, if you will. So I hope that helped clarify the distinction between the pop culture claymore, quote unquote, and the actual claymore. And feel free to submit questions for the Canadian War Museum for when I get there. So you can enter the giveaway for one of 4 family admissions to the Canadian War Museum. That's up to 5 people, and 2 of which can be adults. And I'm going to link a Google Doc down below so you can go there and enter your questions that you would like me to ask the historian at the Canadian War Museum when I'm there. And then the museum will randomly pick and contact the winners a few days after the video is published. All right, hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, and have a good one, folks.